So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here as a humble journalist in such distinguished company. And listening to these remarks from my two distinguished predecessors at this podium, I found myself agreeing with many things that both of them said, which leaves me with basically two choices. I can either play the mediator here between them, or I can go off on some sort of radical tangent and defend, as Bill suggested, a return to a pre-modern agrarian society built around a warrior elite, monks, nuns, poets, troubadours, and so on. And since this is the University of Dallas, I figure that I could keep you here wrapped on that theme for hours and hours, so it's very tempting. But instead, I'll be dull and boring and defend the modern democratic compromise and yada, 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 and talk a little bit about what I think the issue of inequality means for the challenges we face today. And again, I think that in different ways, both of the speakers have identified versions of those challenges in ways that I completely agree with. I think I might try and tweak actually the framework that they share, though. I think both of them argued that it's important to talk about inequality because its consequences matter, and obviously they had some disagreements about what its consequences actually are. I think in my remarks I'm going to sort of circle around to the conclusion that inequality may matter because it is itself a consequence of other trends that we should deplore or at least be concerned about, and that therefore, well, I'll come around to what that means. But to begin with, I think it's useful, and again, I think this is an area of agreement to say we are, again, since we are in a sort of boring, relatively stable, modern, liberal, democratic, semi-capitalist society, to recognize that we are arguing about inequality within a pretty narrow framework, insofar as both liberals and conservatives, both libertarians and liberals, whatever sort of divisions you prefer in these debates, generally agree, on the one hand, that in certain ways, certain forms of inequality are a good of a free society, a sign of divergent interests, a sign of talents and freedoms freely pursued. There are obviously sort of versions of the left and versions of that might, quibble with exactly how much economic freedom is a good thing. But in general, in our political debates, there is an assumption that we aren't against people getting rich. We aren't against people not getting rich because they're choosing to do things that don't help them get rich, but fulfill them in some other way. And that some sort of divergence, some sort of dispersion of income is what you would expect in a society where people are different and where people are diverse and where people have a wide array of interests that lead them in all kinds of different places, and that we benefit from that diversity, and therefore we benefit from some forms of economic inequality necessarily. And then at the same time, I think there would be agreement, again, for almost all voices on the right of the political spectrum, that you can imagine versions of economic inequality that are bad, that are troubling, that are a problem, that reflect, in a sense, the sort of capture of resources by a kind of bandit class of elites. And I think Professor Grieve very eloquently expressed one version of this in his critique of rent-seeking and crony capitalism and so on, and that Professor Galston's suggestion of the dangers of the U.S. turning into Brazil, I think, is evocative in a way that I think most political conservatives, most free marketeers, most libertarians would tend to agree with. They might differ with liberals on why Brazil is Brazil, but they would agree that the kind of extremes of inequality that you see in Latin America, that you see in the distinction between the ruling class and the masses in many countries in the developing world in general, reflect versions of economic inequality that are signs of real things gone wrong, basically. Things gone wrong in some cases from the very beginning, and that reflect an unjust distribution of wealth, an unjust capture of wealth by particular families, particular cabals, and so forth. So the question for us in the U.S. and the West, but particularly in the U.S., looking at the trend in inequality over the last 30 or 40 years, and I guess we're heading up towards 45 or 50, depending on where you date the end of the Great Depression from, Great Compression, excuse me, not the Great Depression, but the end of the Great Compression from, whether that inequality that we've seen and that, debates about the Gini coefficient notwithstanding, we can all agree is real to some extent. Whether that inequality is closer to the first kind of inequality, the kind that we should celebrate or at least accept as part of the pursuit of the goods of a free society, or whether it's closer to the second kind, the kind that we should be deeply troubled by. And first I'm going to try and talk myself into the proposition that it isn't a problem, and then I'll sort of circle back around to reasons why it might, in fact, be a problem, but in a sort of second-order way. So the arguments that I make to myself, and that I occasionally make in print, sometimes in arguments with my friends further to the political left, to the effect that inequality is not the problem, or certainly not a primary problem, a primary area of concern for us as we sort of enumerate the various crises and challenges facing the United States right now. Start with the fact that it's very easy to tell stories about recent American history in which you just can't connect the dots directly between an increase of inequality and, some other specific, universally agreed upon bad thing that people are concerned about. And I'll start with an example that I usually use in arguments with liberals. It's not necessarily as persuasive if I'm having an argument with a conservative who's concerned about inequality, but there aren't that many conservatives who are concerned about inequality, so that's less of an issue. But you start with an issue like immigration, right? So if you talk about the story of the Great Compression, the story of how and that connects in certain ways to the story Bill was telling about solidarity, right? This kind of social solidarity and cohesion that you saw in American society between the 1920s and 1960s, this period when incomes were compressed, when the middle class was very strong, and when you really did have this sort of unity of purpose that was joined to a certain amount of paranoia and witch hunting and so on that liberals are less nostalgic for. But there was real, I think, unity and cohesion to American society in that period that doesn't obtain to the same extent today. But that unity and cohesion came after the United States closed its doors in a fairly draconian way to mass immigration and basically enforced a 40 or 50 year moratorium on the kind of mass immigration that had defined American life across the late 19th and into the early 20th century. And then in the late 1960s, we reversed that process and we entered our new era of mass immigration that's continued to the present day. And debates about what precise factor leads to what precise amount of inequality are complicated, and there's no question that the growth of economic inequality is not entirely or largely explained by mass immigration trends, but there's no question that it's partially explained by immigration trends, and there's no question at a basic level that a society that admits large numbers of low-skilled immigrants is going to become a more unequal society over time. And if you look at the story of the U.S. and income inequality and social cohesion and so on over the last 100-odd years, it's very easy to tell a story in which we purchased a large amount of compressed incomes and social cohesion for about 40 or 50 years at the price of excluding many millions of people who probably wanted to move here, and that we have cost ourselves a certain amount of social cohesion and a certain amount of compression of incomes by admitting many millions of people, often with very low levels of education, to the U.S. over the last 40 or 50 years. Now, in an argument, again, with a liberal, the tendency is, and again, there are still, I think, a few self-professed liberals who are skeptical about mass immigration. But in general, the view of the liberal left is that mass immigration is a great good, and it's often a sort of cosmic good because it serves the good of people beyond the borders of the U.S. in ways that we should support and so on. And if that's the case, then it's hard to say that the inequality that accompanies mass immigration can possibly be a bad thing in and of itself if it's merely the price we pay for this greater good associated with immigration. Now, so that's sort of one one foray that I would use to suggest the problem with thinking that necessarily the growth of economic inequality is a bad thing per se. Another example would be that, if you just, again, in certain ways, this is a cheap and obvious point, but it's also a useful one, right? That if you want to look at periods where inequality was compressed, the easiest place often to find them, especially in the last 25 or 30 years, is periods of recession, right? That, just as the rich have tended to get richer at a faster rate in periods of growth, because their income is bound up in stock market fluctuations, they tend to get poorer faster in periods, not poorer, they're still quite rich, but they tend to do worse, and the Gini coefficient of the US went down a great deal between 2007 and 2009, I believe, and it went up a great deal between, let's say, 1994 and 1999. But there's no question that the period between 1994 and 1999 was the best period, with great credit to Bill Clinton's administration, let's say, but was the best period for, and Newt Gingrich's Congress, was the best period in the entirety of the last 35 years for wage growth across the board. It was the closest thing we've had to the halcyon days of the 1950s or 1960s, and yet it was also a period when great fortunes were made, when the dot-com boom was booming, and when inequality went up. So it can't be enough to say that if inequality is going up necessarily, that's a bad thing for the working class or the middle class, and because just the record of sort of expansions and contractions over the last 25 or 30 years offers obvious counterexamples. And we can dig into the weeds a bit more on this in the back and forth, though maybe we don't want to. I do differ with Bill in thinking that the obvious correlation between income inequality and things that both right and left agree are bad things. So slower growth, weakened social mobility. I think those correlations are, I guess I'm on Team Scott Winship in this debate overall, and we can maybe import Scott via video conference later on to have his say. But I think that the sort of metrics that are set up to prove that more equal societies have more social mobility, or that as income inequality has gone up, growth has necessarily slowed down, those correlations tend to diminish or disappear, it seems to me, when you look at them more rigorously, control for some obvious factors, and so on. And you can see this just within the US itself. If you dig into the big data set that Raj Chetty and a bunch of fellow brilliant economists put together recently, and there are a lot of interesting arguments to be had about this data set, but it was trying to track basically economic mobility across different parts of the US. And the correlation between economic mobility and family structure was very, very strong. Correlation between economic mobility and straightforward income inequality was just a lot weaker. And again, I could multiply examples, but I think that if you went down the list of places where the right and left agree X is a bad thing, the case that X is necessarily tied to income inequality keeps almost getting made, and then it seems to partially or mostly fall apart. And then to take another example, for instance, the question of sort of political stability, and it's linked to social cohesion. So it's true that the US right now is manifesting a lot of signs of the kind of sort of potentially dangerous populism that Bill's talking about. And I would prefer not to have the election contested between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. I don't think it will be. As a journalist, actually, I'd really like it to be. I can't really back that up. But as a concerned citizen who loves my country, et cetera, and I've actually been, it's been striking in certain ways. I've sort of thought we were overdue for a Trump-like phenomenon, because it's been now, I guess you could go back to 1996 and Ross Perot's second run, but really it's been 24 years, which is a long time to go between meaningful third-party challengers. And Trump isn't a third-party challenger in the sense that he is running in the Republican primary, but he has sort of the spirit of a third-party challenger. He is sort of attacking both parties in different ways from an interesting vantage point. But anyway, with all of that said, allowing that American politics does look a bit more unstable overall than it did a few years ago, and certainly than it did in certain ways in the late 1990s, it's also the case that American politics, notwithstanding the dot-com bust, the Iraq war, the Great Recession, all the various other unfortunate things that have happened in the last 15 or 20 years, has actually been kind of stable relative to everything that went on in US politics between the late 1950s and the mid-1970s, which was a period when the Gini coefficient was a lot lower, when we'd just gone through the Great Compression, when we lived in a society that had experienced this period of strong economic growth for middle class, and yet that period produced actual significant civil violence. And we sort of take for granted now, in certain ways, the civil piece of our politics. But if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, you begin obviously with sort of segregationist terrorism, basically directed against the civil rights movement. And then you segue into left-wing terrorism related to the Vietnam War. And obviously, that sort of blurs into the rising crime rate and general social disorder of that period. But if you were going to, you could, just based on the last 50 or 60 years of American history, you could make an argument, and I don't believe this argument, but I'm saying you could make it, that the Great Compression actually led to more disorder in American life than the recent 20, 30, 40-year increase in economic inequality has. If we've just re-elected 2 consecutive incumbent presidents in our politics. Yes, we keep turning out, would-be Senate majority or speakers of the House and so on. Eric Cantor can't win re-election and so on. But that's a lot different than people blowing up churches in the South and embarking on organized campaigns of terror against the U.S. military because of the Vietnam War and so on. So it just, again, just sort of eyeballing U.S. history over the last 60 years, it doesn't seem obvious to me that our era of economic inequality has produced the kind of real sort of looming civil war, in a sense, that came in the 60s and 70s following a period of much greater economic compression, much greater economic equality, and so on. And then, so those are just sort of a few reasons why, a few examples of why I'm skeptical of the argument that today's inequality per se is a problem for American society. And then I'm also skeptical as a political conservative, in part because so many of the mechanisms for reducing inequality that are on the table seem to me deeply flawed, which is to say, it is relatively easy to see how you could at least modestly reduce the US Gini coefficient. You could raise taxes on the wealthy, and there are limits to how high you can raise them, but those limits are probably higher than the Wall Street Journal editorial board would suppose. You can wring a fair amount of money out of the top 1% and the top 10% and find ways of effectively well, not effectively, but sort of plowing it into public programs that in their design at least are supposed to benefit the broad middle class. But I think there's a lot of evidence that those programs are not likely to deliver significant benefits if funded at increased rates. And I think this is, relatively obvious from the case of primary and secondary education and higher education as well over the last 30 or 40 years, where the amount of money that we've spent has gone up significantly without producing any kind of dramatic increase in test scores or economic outcomes, obviously, and so on. And I think you can make a similar case about most of the legacy programs that we've inherited from the Great Society and the New Deal, that as effective as these programs may be, the work of raising taxes on the rich would mostly be to sustain programs that are in many ways in need of reform and that don't necessarily create the kind of broad-based working age prosperity. And there's, I think, a distinction between working age prosperity and retirement stability that we can dig into a little bit later on. But I'm just deeply skeptical that avoiding some needed reforms to Medicare and spending more on sort of public school bureaucracy and so on down a list of conservative hobby horses, but legitimate hobby horses, is necessarily going to redound to the public good, even if it does technically reduce overall inequality and knocks down the Gini coefficient a little bit. So that's sort of a list of reasons for skepticism. And I could go on, and I will go on if given the opportunity later. But then I do have to ask myself, well, all right, Ross, what do you, if inequality per se isn't the problem, isn't the biggest problem, isn't necessarily a problem at all facing American life, what do you think are the problems? And here my list probably overlaps with my predecessors in certain ways, and also differs with them in certain ways. But first of all, I think we can all probably agree that economic stagnation overall and stagnation of wages for lower income, middle income Americans is a problem, a significant problem. I would argue that that sort of in defense in certain ways of Charles Murray, that the self-segregation, the sort of social and cultural self-segregation of the top 1 to 5 to 10%, the fact that college graduates in the United States increasingly concentrate themselves in a small number of large cities, or that sort of human capital is not as widely dispersed as it was 50 or 60 years ago, is a problem for American life, because it basically creates a stratification of human capital, and the human capital that in community actually leads to human flourishing, that it's good for communities to have a diverse array of gifts manifested in the communities themselves. And if the most gifted Americans, at least by certain measures, if none of them want to live in, towns in upstate New York, if they all want to live in New York City, then the people left behind in the towns in upstate New York are going to have a lower quality of life just because they don't have the same kind of contact with sort of people, social groups, and so on, richer in human capital than they are. And linked to that, I think, and this is where my sort of social conservatism comes out, is the fact that I think we have a sort of sexual, social ethic in American society that leads to greater levels of human flourishing for the upper class and well-educated, and lower levels of human flourishing for just about everybody else. And I think that the triumph of a certain kind of permissiveness after the 1960s has led to large-scale human unhappiness, and that human unhappiness tends to be concentrated among people who, again, have lower levels of sort of human capital broadly defined, who don't have the same educational advantages, don't have the same incomes, don't have the same wealth that obtains for people who attend elite universities and who are capable of sort of navigating a sort of signpost-free sexual landscape without ending up having what the social scientists now call multi-partner fertility, which is the sort of bloodless way of talking about the phenomenon that you can watch on a show like Teen Mom, that, again, I think doesn't redound to human happiness in the long run. So you have that sort of problem of problems of the aftermath of the sexual revolution. Then you have the problem, and Professor Gravey talked about a great deal, of sort of public institutions beset by or barnacled by interest groups, basically, by rent seekers and so on, in ways that make it impossible to reform existing institutions, existing programs, and so on. All the complaints and fears that I just listed about, the problem with spending more money on Medicare or more money on public schools and so on, are partially problems precisely because the healthcare system, the education system, and so on are so barnacled with interest groups, because the regulatory state is so enmeshed with the companies that it is allegedly supposed to be regulating and so on, that reform is not impossible, but at least very, very difficult. And this is a problem for both liberalism and conservatism. It's a problem for liberalism because it means you can't recapture the glory days of the heroic age of liberalism. You can't do what FDR did or even what LBJ did, because the system that previous liberal administrations have built is often impervious to change. But then it's obviously a problem for conservatives too, because they want to change the system that liberals built, and that system frustrates their efforts. And that in turn, I think, feeds into the problem of economic stagnation that I mentioned. And then connected to that problem, I think, is the reality that the wage stagnation that we're seeing may indeed reflect sort of deep technological shifts in the global economy that simply make the value of ordinary human labor less than it was in 1947 or 1964, and those trends show very little sign of reversing themselves. So that's sort of a short list of problems facing the American economy and American society. Well, then if I set out and say to myself, all right, well, imagine that those problems could be magically solved. And I obviously don't have magical solutions for all of them. We can get into potential solutions later on, but if those problems could be magically solved, right? If you, let's say, for instance, to play the social conservative, if you had a return to a more restrained sexual ethic in American life, to imagine a world where you suddenly could strip the barnacles off public programs, strip the interest groups out of Washington politics, and so on. If you imagined a world just with stronger growth, per se, with 3.5% growth, 4% growth, 5% growth, whatever Mike Huckabee is promising, 13% growth. Imagine that world. If you imagined a world where the well-educated elite were less self-segregated, where having a college diploma or a graduate degree did not necessarily encourage you to move immediately to the same place that all your friends from college are moving from and leave, if you did come from a middle American hometown, leave that hometown behind permanently. If we lived in a world where, whether through changes to the economic landscape or through some sort of wage subsidy or public provision, that you had sort of returns to labor go up again a little bit more, so that people at the bottom end of the economic spectrum could feel like they were getting ahead, could feel like their children, as Bill suggested, were going to lead more prosperous lives than they did. If any or all of these things happened in the way that I think would be good for America if they did happen, I think we would actually end up with less income inequality. We would end up with a lower Gini coefficient. And if that's the case, then I have to talk myself into, to some extent, or have to concede to some extent, the idea that I do think income inequality is a problem. But to return to where I sort of hesitatingly began, I think it matters because it is a consequence of other bigger problems. And just starting out to say we're going to solve income inequality and all those other problems will take care of itself is looking at things through the wrong end of the telescope. In fact, what we should be saying is we have rising rates of income inequality that in certain ways are a problem because they reflect these other things that we should all agree are actually problems. And if we could find ways to address these other things, we would probably end up with less income inequality. But even if we didn't, we would at least have solved more pressing and immediate concerns. So that's my sort of halting attempt to build a bridge between the two previous speakers and set up a slightly different way of thinking about the issue that we're all discussing here tonight. So I'll leave things there. Thank you very much.